Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters and you have found me on my weekly live chat where I talk about quilting and answer your questions live. And even if you're not watching live, you can always leave your questions in the comments because I love to get on there and answer them. But if you are watching live, you can type your questions in the chat because Jessica's here keeping an eye on the chat and I'll answer those questions live at the end. So super excited about that. Not a whole lot going on this week. It's been kind of a chill week. I think that's always the nice part about January. So in this week's live chat, I'm going to talk about swirling feathers. I don't know if that's the actual right name for it because I thought branching feathers just doesn't sound as pretty. So I thought we'll just call it swirling feathers. But we're going to talk about this technique where we quilt the feathers in kind of chunks so that they kind of branch off of each other. Let me just go right to the pictures and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Maybe that will help make it a little bit more sense. So in this idea, I'm not quilting just one straight feather. I'm kind of quilting it so that it branches off of itself. This is really ideal for very large spaces that you want to fill in. If you think about just a regular typical feather, we can only quilt that so wide. I mean, you can quilt it pretty big, but after a while it gets a little insane. So if you want something that takes up a lot more room, quilting them so that they kind of branch off each other is going to help it fill in that space. Plus, it really does give your quilt like this super complex, ornate look to it, but it's actually a lot easier than you might think. So I'm going to break it down here in a second, but let's kind of see some more examples of this technique before we see that. I did this most recently on the Tulip Pinks butterfly quilt because there was a lot of space to fill in. And I kind of tried to make it where it looked like it was coming together or kind of symmetrical on both sides and kind of meeting in the middle. Just showing you that you don't have to quilt it continuously. You don't have to have one that just wraps around and joins back into itself. This is such a big, beautiful feather. It can do whatever it wants. There's no rules for it. And then once you quilt it, filling it in with a filler that's really going to make it pop. This isn't a difficult feather if you already know how to quilt the feather design, but it does take a little bit longer to come together. So if you're going to take the time to work with this kind of design, you probably want to show it off. So using a filler like pebbles or dense swirls to really kind of, make it shine there. Now at the top of the quilt, I know we've seen this in an earlier live chat, but I wanted the feathers to kind of look like antenna because it's a butterfly and kind of give that effect. So I kind of tried to make them somewhat symmetrical. I mean, if you look really close, you'll see that those two sides are not perfectly the same, but they're close enough where one swirls down, the other swirls down. This was just a design choice I made for this particular quilt. It's not necessary for this feather design. So if you're working with a large space and you don't want to have to worry about keeping it symmetrical, you don't have to. So it can be its own wild, wonderful self. One thing I want to point out about this picture though is I have a lot of echoing on that spine. So the spine is really built up here and we're going to see why I did that here in a second when I get to drawing. But just know that that's an option that you have. You can either have some traveling over that spine or you can add some more echo lines. And I'll draw both of those out, but just kind of keep this mental picture in your mind when we get to the actual learning how the design goes together. And then I think this is the last one. Again, just some real quick pictures to show you the idea of the feather here. Now, when I draw this out and as I demonstrate it, I'm gonna use the custom feather technique. And if you did participate in the Feathers Free Motion Challenge, you know what I'm talking about. But it's this ornate feather that kind of builds up from the bottom. You can do this with the more basic feather if you'd like, but it looks so beautiful when you do this custom feather. So I'm going to show you how to do it that way, but just know there is a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of leeway that you have with design ideas and with your own style. So I'll show you how I do it. I'll give you some tips, but then ultimately you're going to take this technique and you're going to make it your own and make it look great on your quilts. So let's go to my handy dandy, super high-tech drawing board. So what I love about drawing out the designs, it really gives me a chance to show you how it goes together and you can kind of see it develop, whereas on a sewing machine sometimes it's a little difficult to see it kind of coming together. It doesn't matter if you're trying this technique on a sewing machine or a long arm, it's going to go together the same way. So even though on a sewing machine the movement might be different than drawing, you're still going to have the basic idea. So first, let's kind of wrap our mind around what the base of this design is. So like every custom feather that we learned, it has a spine, right? It has that center. The difference is here, I'm quilting my spine in chunks. It's not one long continuous bit. So if I were to imagine my spine kind of coming here, and then I'm going to end it in a curve, right? This is going to be a nice wide curve for a couple reasons. I really want this to take up space in my area, right? Remember, I'm putting this in a large area, but I'm going to have petals on both sides of this, and I want to make sure there's enough room for them. So nice and wide. If you have to kind of imagine maybe even hand-sized, give it some space. It's a lot easier to add echoing to fill in those areas than it is to try to cram a feather in it. Now the next one is going to kind of branch off of it, right? So if I look at my spine, it's almost just going to come off like this. Now, these could be longer or shorter. I'm just kind of filling in the space I have here, so don't feel like it has to be this long. But what I want to kind of show you is, imagine like if this swirl or this part wasn't here, that this would continue on. You want it to look almost fluid, or like it would just kind of turn into it. I don't know if that makes sense. But basically, I don't want it to be like a sharp jutting out. I want it to kind of just beautifully come off of that. That's what's going to give it that elegant look. Then I can just keep going, adding my sections and working my way through the area. Now, if I imagine quilting a feather, right now I have my spine and I'm going to put my petals on both sides like I normally would. I'm going to quilt these sections just like I would any shorter feather. But at these junctures, where those spines come apart from each other, they're going to kind of compete for space. So what I'm going to do is just quilt a teardrop in those areas, and that's going to give me a little bit of room so that I can have my petals on both sides. Again, we're going to see this here in a second, but I'm just kind of giving you the very foundation of our beautiful feather. So if we were to take all the echoing, all the traveling, all the petals off, this is basically what we would see. When I'm working on a quilt with a lot of big space, and I'm working with this technique, especially when it's for Tula Pink's quilt, I mark out these sections. So I take my blue water-soluble pen and I just mark out kind of where I want those curls to go. That's just to help give me a reference line. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the main idea is just kind of being able to see where I'm going. All right, so now that we know how that goes together, let's kind of talk about how we're going to actually quilt that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my red marker again, and let's see it again. Again, so nice curve. I want to make the next one look like it's just coming out of it. And these, again, don't have to be super short. They could be wavy, they could be longer, they could go further, they could branch out as far as you want. I kind of keep them somewhat close to each other. So let's pretend this is my marked line. These are the general reference lines I have marked on my quilt so that I can have a good reference line. And I'm going to do the quilting in my black pen. The tricky part about this design isn't quilting the feathers, it's just maneuvering where you need to go. That's probably the main reason I don't teach this in classes, and I haven't even done a video on this before, because there's just a lot of figuring out where to go. It's not difficult, just takes a couple more steps. So track with me, and I think you'll figure it out. And if you don't, leave a question and Jessica will give it to me later. All right, so I have my marked lines. I'm going to start quilting. So I'm going to start quilting my first spine. There we go. I'm going to end here. Now, if I'm doing the custom feather, that starts from the bottom and works its way up. So if I'm here, I need to get to the bottom of my feather. But if we look at this, I have two sides. This is just my preference, only my opinion. I like to quilt along the outside of the feather first so that there's plenty of room for those petals. Sometimes if I start in the inside, I might make my petals too big and there won't be enough for the outside. And I'd rather have the outside kind of be big and beautiful and then just cram the inside in. Again, that's just my preference. So if I'm here and I'm going to do the outside, I need to get to this point. So I could either backtrack if I need to, but usually I just add an echo line there. This is completely up to you. It really depends on how contrasting your thread is, how comfortable you feel with echoing or backtracking. I could, of course, just break thread and go back to that point. Now, if you've listened to any of my live chats, you know that I'm not usually a big fan of breaking thread, but for this quilt I did do that, or for Tula's quilt I did do that a lot. Now that I'm at my juncture, I'm going to quilt my teardrop, and that's just going to kind of fill in that space. So once I have that, I can start quilting my petals along the outside of my frond, or my spine. So again, I'm doing the more custom technique. I'm adding my petals. They're quilted in groups of 2. They're going out, traveling, and coming back. And I'm really extending those out, trying to really make it fill in that area. And I'm going to go all the way around that swirl like this. So again, I just want to make it have plenty of room, make it look gorgeous. Now from this point, now that I have the outside of this swirl done, I can go ahead and echo my way back to this part and then do the same on the other side. Again, I like to do this outside first so it has a lot more room, and then the inside I just kind of fit in where it goes. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to quilt my little petals. If I run out of room, which is a definite possibility, I mean, as we're quilting it, this thing is curling over on itself, so we're gonna get to a spot where there's not enough room. I'm just gonna either make them fit in or make them smaller, but I do wanna make sure that I fill in this whole area. Whether it's with petals or with echo lines and a filler, it doesn't matter. For the most part, I like to just go ahead and add plenty of petals. I wanna fill it all in. And you can see there's my pretty feather. It's gonna look weird right here. Remember, if you did the Feathers Free Motion Challenge, we talked about turning the corner. Whenever you have a spine that curves like that, the inside of the curve is gonna have less room. So some of your petals might lay on top of each other, but ultimately, the most important thing is that you fill in that whole space as much as possible. Now, if you remember, I ended kind of right here. If I'm thinking ahead and I'm paying attention, I might leave a little bit of a gap here so I can echo my way back out. Or I might just use some traveling along that previously quilted petal to get out of there. Now that means that if I'm incorporating traveling, it's gonna get kind of thread heavy. So I'm definitely gonna use a matching thread color for this, or even a thinner thread. Now the quilted examples that you saw in the picture were quilted with 40 weight thread, so it's a little bit thicker. But since it matched the color of the background, you didn't see that build up too bad. Whatever I'm gonna do, I wanna get back to my spine because I need to then work on my next frond, right? So section 1 here is done, and I'm ready to start section 2. But if you remember, if I'm looking at this section, I like to do the outside first. If I could just get myself okay with doing the inside first, it would save a lot of heartache. But I just love how that looks along the outside. So I have an option here. I could either just break thread, come to this point, which is probably what I would do, or like you saw in that example, I could just build up that echo line. I could echo my spine all the way to here and continue on. Or if you need more options, I could echo all the way around here and squeeze in there and then go on. It doesn't matter how you get there, just get there to add your next one. Again, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to do that outside first. So however I get there, there I am. And I'm going to do the outside, but remember I have my little juncture here. So I'll echo back, quilt my teardrop. Now I know that line's getting a little shaky because I'm kind of reaching out, but you can pretend it's a pretty quilted design. One thing I want to talk about right here, if you notice, I have an echo line that just goes to here. What about this side? I'm not too worried about it. I'm not too worried that the echo goes all the way back, but that just depends on your preference. You're gonna have to kind of decide how you feel about that, and if you don't like the look of the echo stopping part way. I will tell you that once the whole feather is done, all that you're gonna notice is the petals, that unquilted area in the petals. So figure out what you like, but I don't worry too much about it. All right, so let's go back to my quilting my feathers, my custom feathers. Again, don't be afraid to really extend it out there. Since I'm quilting this in a very large area, I have plenty of room, and I really want to extend it out because if you think about it, if I'm going to be putting really teeny tiny pebbles around that, the more room I take up with the feather, the easier that's going to be. So right now you can kind of see it's looking pretty weird, right? I have like this thing coming out here, but once I get to this part, to the center, I've finished that outside. Now I can continue to add my petals on here because this is the inside of that segment. Now it's going to be a little bit longer than this one. No problem. We can handle that. And I know I need to get back down here to start quilting my custom feather, and you can get back there any way you want. Now you can probably start to see why my spines get so many echo lines, especially in that picture that I showed you, that quilted picture. I love it because the feather is so big and beautiful, it can handle a spine that's a little thicker, and it's just quicker and easier for me than breaking thread. I don't mind echoing back. Okay, so now that I'm at the bottom, I can do the same thing, quilting my petals. Again, I'm doing the custom technique. You can do any of the little variations we've learned. And then I'm not too afraid to make these too big, but I know I've got to cram it in here. So as I see this part coming, I need to start making them a little smaller. Uh-oh. Well, our power just went out. That's why you can't see what I'm doing. All right, let me come back to here real quick so you can see my face. So basically what I'm doing is I'm adding that petals along that inside, and it's just really kind of filling it in. Again, sorry, the lights are just going nuts, so will you just turn on the overhead for me? So I know we didn't quite get to see all of that because this camera is connected to the power source, so I can't keep going. But the idea being that you can really keep building off of it. I know, gosh, I wish I could have just turned the overhead one on. Oh, they're off. That power's out too. Okay, well, that makes sense. Okay, I digress. Hopefully everybody can still hear me okay. So what I'm doing is I'm quilting those in sections, and I know I didn't quite get to it, and I'll have to kind of revisit this next week. We'll have to redo that. But the idea being that I'm just quilting it in sections. And as I come into that inner swirl, and I run out of room, I'm just gonna squeeze those petals in a little bit smaller, and I'm gonna use echoing to get out of there. So the basic idea is I'm quilting it in sections. Again, the trickiest part about this technique or working with this feather design is just knowing how to get to the next spot. Like you saw me break it down, if I'm gonna quilt the outside first, I need to get to that point first. And so that's the one reason that I don't teach this a lot in my classes or my videos, but hopefully that made some kind of sense. And I think what I'll do is next week, I'm gonna talk about thread painting, but during the thread painting, I will kind of demonstrate this on a sewing machine so you can kind of see what it looks like when it's actually quilted. Now, just like any design though, as you're quilting it and as you're trying to figure out where to go next, the best thing to do is just stop, think through the next couple steps, and just kind of get where you need to go and then move on. So I think you'll find it's a really cool technique to take up those big areas of your quilts. So like, what quilts should you use this on though, right? Because I think when you look at this big ornate feather, you might think, oh, I don't have a quilt specifically in mind for this. Again, you're gonna wanna use this in larger areas of background space or negative space. It's gonna be really great in those, or you can do it over the whole quilt. It doesn't have to be in a background. It can go over the top of blocks, especially if you have busier fabrics and you just want to give the technique a try without like committing to trying to figure it all out. So it's definitely one of those that'll be a lot of fun. Now I know our quilting or drawing demo got cut off because the power is out. It's probably because it's so freaking cold out there. But hopefully that gave you enough to get the gist of it. And so go ahead and give that a try, practice drawing it out, practice quilting it. And then next week, as a part of our thread painting live chat, I'll kind of demonstrate that and maybe have some diagrams for you to download to help you out with that. Now, I know I just kind of got into it before we got cut off, but I wonder if there's any questions that have come through with that. Jessica's pulling them together for me. Don't mind the flickering. It's just the light's trying to come on. I think it gives it kind of a dance vibe. See it? So, okay, do I plan ahead or do I stitch totally free motion quilting? Okay, I do plan ahead sometimes, right? So with that feather or a butterfly, and I wanted it to kind of wrap around. So while I don't have it planned out so much that I'm marking out every single little bit, I do have the general idea. Sometimes I just go for it. But with this particular feather, it's usually good to have a somewhat of a game plan. You want to kind of know where it's going because you're going to be branching off. You're going to kind of be taking detours before you get to the actual end. So having a little bit of a plan is a good idea. The only thing I would just kind of hesitate is if you're so focused on a plan, you can't be committed to it that you can't change it. You have to be willing to change your plan. That's an easier way to say it. You have to be willing to change your plan because sometimes you have this great idea and you start and it doesn't work out like that. Maybe you need to make the swirls bigger or smaller. Don't be afraid to change your plan once you're going because that's usually how it goes. When I say breaking thread, do I mean knotting off and starting again in a different area? Yes, I do. It's just easier to say breaking thread. I don't know where I picked that up because it does sound very like aggressive. Like I'm gonna break that thread. I should say tie off and begin again. But knotting off or just basically breaking my line of quilting and starting again. So yes, that is what I mean. Thank you for clarifying. Do I have to do a tiny background or can I just do swirly feathers? Okay, you can do whatever you want. Absolutely, you can do swirly feathers. I will say it's really hard to fill in the whole area with feathers like that because if you have a big area, you're trying to make them all fit and you might go a little crazy trying to do that. I would say if you're practicing them, practice quilting a couple swirly feathers and then use some swirls or a feather meander to fill in between them so that you just get that nice all over texture. But ultimately, this is one of those things that is a wow part of your quilt. So I love makeup. It's kind of like makeup. It's like the black eyeliner, right? Like, yeah, I could put black eyeliner and then mat it down, but usually that's like the main focus of it. So yes, you can fill in around it and hide it, but usually this is going to be an element that you want to show off. This is going to be something that's going to draw attention to a part of a quilt or really help give it a framing effect. So you can, but it's up to you. All right, what is the largest that I would make the petals of the feather? It depends. I'm sorry, I know that's not funny. I make them pretty big. I mean, they're a good couple inches big. If you think about the area that I have to fill in, I really want to make this feather nice and big. So good, maybe 3 or 4 inches, about as big as I would go. It just depends on how much control you have. If you can feel comfortable quilting a really long one and backtracking, coming back, perfect. Then definitely do that. I will say on a sewing machine, my petals tend to be shorter because I don't have quite as much of movement on that as I do on my long arm. And it depends on the space. If I'm filling this in a little bit smaller space and I have, a little bit smaller area, then I'll make them a little bit smaller to fit in as well. But ultimately, you want to make them as big as you can, but still have command of what you're doing. That's the most important thing. One thing you can do, and I know I've said this in an earlier video, if you've quilted or marked out your spine, you can mark out a reference line that's a good couple inches away, and then that can act kind of as your guide to make them all similar. I am trying to make them similar-ish in width, but there's that. All right, so that's good questions, and I'm glad that you guys love that I'm still going. Hey, look, I have done enough teaching, enough classes that, man, there's always something, always something. One time I landed, it'd be funny if anybody here would know me, that I did a guild in Florida, and I landed late. The plane was late, and so I went right from the airport right into my first class, and my luggage didn't make it. And so I taught a whole class with no samples, no books, no handouts, nothing. And after that, I thought, okay, if I can do this, shoot, I'm pretty sure I can handle anything. So the flashing lights are just, a little bit of the ambiance. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to finish it so you can see it, but like I said, we'll definitely dive into that a little bit more next week. Speaking of next week, we're going to be talking about thread painting. So I know that's been a big question that's come up, and we're going to talk about how you can kind of use thread colors to create different effects and show you kind of what that looks like when it comes together. Kind of how I do it, maybe not like artistic thread painting, but just playing with the thread colors. And if you have any topic suggestions, I would love for you to leave them in the comment section, because I take my topic ideas directly from people that watch. So I get on to the video about half an hour before we go live and type chat with everybody, and all these topics have come up directly from that. So I'm definitely open to what you want to learn about. So next week will be thread painting, and then the week after, I've had a request to talk about wind. How do I quilt wind? So I think I'll turn that into nature elements, wind and pebbles and maybe some fiery looking stuff. So it'll be a great time. Well, I know that most of the country is freezing cold. I hope that you stay warm. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next Thursday, where we'll go over to this, and I will probably have a backup power generator so this doesn't happen again. So until then, everybody, happy quilting.